The wagon lurched, a final, jarring halt that echoed the sudden stop in Elias Thorne's carefully laid plans. He climbed down, legs stiff from the long journey, the dust of the trail clinging to his worn coat. In his pocket, the letter from Martha Jennings felt warm, a small beacon of promise in this vast, indifferent land. Her words spoke of a shared future, of a sturdy farmhouse, willing hands to build a life on the Nebraska prairie. He looked up, not at the welcoming homestead he'd envisioned, but at a skeletal structure, weathered and gray, leaning as if weary of its own existence. The porch sagged, windows were missing panes, patched with rags that fluttered like surrender flags. A chilling wind swept across the flat expanse, carrying the scent of decay and something else, desolation. A girl, no more than 15, emerged from the shadowed doorway. Her dress was faded, too small, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes held a woman's wariness. Behind her, smaller figures huddled, pale faces peering out. 7 of them, he counted, a silent, accusing audience. "Mr. Thorne?" Her voice was low, rough for a girl her age. Elias nodded, his throat too tight for words. He'd rehearsed his greeting, a polite introduction, an expression of his hopes for their life with Martha. Now, the practiced phrases died unspoken. The girl's gaze didn't waver. "Sent for you, a statement, not a question." Then, her voice dropped further, flat and devoid of emotion. "She's gone. Took sick a month past. Buried her out yonder." She gestured vaguely towards a rise beyond the withered corn stalks. "Gone." The word was a physical blow. Martha, his correspondent, his reason for crossing half a continent, was dead. He stood rooted, the letter in his pocket suddenly a cruel, mocking weight. The 7 children, ranging from the tall, distrustful girl to a toddler clutching a soiled rag doll, watched him. Their silence was louder than any accusation. The wind whistled through the broken panes, a mournful sigh. This was not the new beginning he'd paid his passage for. This was an ending, stark and brutal, before he'd even had a chance to begin. The hope he'd carried so carefully, nurtured across miles of unforgiving terrain, shattered like thin ice under a heavy boot. He saw their eyes, though hollow, frightened, yet with a spark of desperate curiosity. What would this stranger do? He felt the question hanging in the air, as heavy as the scent of the coming winter. The door creaked shut behind him, a sound of finality. The single room of the cabin was dim, crowded, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale food, and unspoken grief. Elias Thorne sat on a rickety stool, the only one offered, the 7 pairs of eyes fixed on him. The oldest girl, Sarah, stood protectively before the others, her arms crossed. Her pronouncement of her mother's death had been delivered with a starkness that left no room for disbelief, only a numbing shock that was slowly giving way to a bewildering sense of obligation. He should leave. Any sane man would. This was not his burden, not his family. Martha Jennings had promised partnership, a wife, a new farm. She had not mentioned a ready-made family of 7 orphans in a derelict cabin on the edge of nowhere. Yet, as he looked at their pinched faces, the way the smallest one, a boy barely 3, hiccuped a quiet sob against his sister's leg, the thought of walking away felt like a betrayal too profound to contemplate. Martha's letter, still in his pocket, had spoken of her children, briefly, of her need for help, for a husband to share the load. He'd imagined a couple of young ones, perhaps. Not this small tribe, alone and adrift. Night fell quickly, the prairie wind moaning around the flimsy walls. Sarah managed to light a tallow dip, its meager flame casting long, dancing shadows that made the children flinch. She offered him a piece of dry cornbread, the last of it, he suspected. He broke it, giving the larger piece back to her. "For the little ones," he said, his voice raspy. It was the first thing he'd managed beyond a nod. She hesitated, then took it, her eyes still guarded. He spent the night on the floor, wrapped in his own thin blanket, the cold seeping up from the packed earth. Sleep was impossible. The soft rustles and occasional whimpers from the children were a constant reminder of their presence, their vulnerability. He thought of Martha, a woman he'd never met, only knew through her carefully penned letters. What desperation had led her to advertise for a husband, to paint a picture so far removed from this grim reality? Or had disaster struck so swiftly, so completely after her last hopeful missive? He rose before dawn, the children still asleep in a tangled heap on a straw pallet. He stepped outside into the biting air. The desolation of the landscape mirrored the emptiness within him. There were no easy answers here, no clear path. Only need. He found the woodpile, a pitifully small collection of branches. The axe was dull, its handle loose. He began to chop, the rhythmic thud a counterpoint to the turmoil in his mind. One by one, the children emerged, drawn by the sound. They watched him, silent, from the doorway. He was a stranger, an unknown quantity. But he was here. And he was working. It wasn't a plan, not yet. It was just a response to the immediate, the undeniable. The wood needed chopping. The children needed everything. The sun, a pale disk in the grey sky, did little to warm the chilling air. Elias methodically stacked the newly chopped wood, his hands already raw. The children remained clustered near the cabin, their movement small and hesitant, like startled birds. Sarah, the eldest, directed the others with hushed commands, a miniature matriarch burdened too soon. He saw the state of them clearly now, threadbare clothes, thin limbs, eyes that held a weariness far beyond their years. Martha's passing, he learned in clipped sentences from Sarah, had been swift, a fever that burned through her in days, leaving them stunned and alone. Neighbors, few and distant, had helped with the burial, offered what meager condolences they could, and then retreated to their own struggles. There was no one else. The responsibility settled upon Elias, heavy and unyielding. He surveyed the cabin's interior again in the daylight. Dirt floor, leaking roof, a fireplace that smoked more than it drew. The food stores were nearly non-existent, a handful of withered potatoes, a shrinking sack of cornmeal, a little salt. He found Martha's Bible on a small, dusty shelf, its pages worn thin, a dried prairie flower marking a passage in Psalms. Beside it, a small, leather-bound journal. He opened it cautiously. Her handwriting, the same neat script as in her letters, filled the pages, not with grand plans, but with daily struggles, prayers for her children, and a quiet, persistent hope that sometimes wavered but never fully extinguished. Praying for strength, she'd written just weeks before her last letter to him. "The children are my heart." Mr. Thorne's reply gives me a flicker of light. He closed the journal, a lump in his throat. Her hopes had been so fragile, so tied to his arrival. And he had arrived too late for her. But not, perhaps, for them. He turned to the children. "We need water," he said, his voice more firm than he felt. Thomas, a boy of about 12 with his mother's serious eyes, flinched but then nodded slowly. "The creek's a ways," he mumbled. "Bucket's got a hole." Elias found the bucket, indeed rusted through in one spot. He'd have to see to that. Small tasks. One at a time. He looked at Mary, a quiet girl of 10. "Can you help sweep the floor?" She looked at Sarah, who gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Mary picked up a worn broom. The twin boys, Samuel and Daniel, around 8, watched him with wide, unblinking eyes, identical in their apprehension. Lydia, 5, clung to Sarah's skirt, while Ben, the youngest, had fallen asleep again, his small face pale. Elias felt a surge of something akin to despair, quickly suppressed. Despair was a luxury he couldn't afford. He had to think, to plan. His dream of a prosperous farm with Martha had vanished. Now, it was simply about survival. Winter was coming. And he, a stranger, was all these children had. The days settled into a rhythm of relentless labor. Elias rose before light, the chill of the prairie air a constant companion. He mended the leaking roof with scavenged pieces of sod and timber, patched the bucket, and reinforced the flimsy cabin walls against the ever-present wind. He hunted, his old rifle thankfully reliable, bringing back rabbits or the occasional prairie bird, meager additions to their dwindling stores but vital nonetheless. The children watched him. Always watching. Their silence was the hardest part. It was a wall, built of grief and suspicion, and he didn't know how to breach it. Sarah remained his reluctant conduit, answering his direct questions with curt replies, her eyes challenging him, daring him to fail, to leave. He knew she expected it. Perhaps even hoped for it, in some conflicted part of her young heart, so she wouldn't have to depend on another stranger who might disappear like a puff of smoke. The trip to the settlement of Prairie Bend was a necessity he'd postponed as long as possible. He needed flour, salt, perhaps some beans if his credit held. He loaded the few pelts he'd managed to cure onto the rickety buckboard that had come with the homestead, its wheels wobbling precariously. He decided to take Thomas with him, hoping the boy might know who his mother had dealt with. Thomas sat beside him, stiff and silent, clutching a small, carved bird Martha had made for him. Prairie Bend was little more than a dusty street with a general store, a smithy, and a raw-looking church. Faces turned as they drove in. He felt their scrutiny, the unspoken questions. A man alone with a boy, both looking like they'd seen harder times than most. At Henderson's Mercantile, a stout, whiskered man regarded him from behind the counter. "Martha Jennings' boy?" Mr. Henderson asked, his voice surprisingly gentle as he looked at Thomas. Thomas nodded, shrinking slightly. Elias stepped forward. "Elias Thorne." I came in answer to Mrs. Jennings's letter." Henderson's gaze sharpened, taking in Elias's worn clothes, his calloused hands. "Heard she passed. Sad thing. Left a passel of young uns, didn't she?" Elias nodded. 7 Henderson whistled softly. "You staying on then?" The question hung in the air. "I am," Elias said, the words tasting of a commitment he was still grappling with. "Need supplies?" "Got some pelts." Henderson inspected the furs, his expression unreadable. "Martha, she had a bit of credit here." "Not much. She was a good woman. Worried herself sick over those children after her husband passed." He paused. "Town talk is they'll have to be split up. Sent to the orphanage in Omaha." Some of them. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "They're staying together. With me." Henderson raised an eyebrow but made no comment, merely starting to tally up the value of the pelts. The storekeeper's words, however, echoed in Elias's mind all the way back to the isolated cabin. The world outside was already deciding the fate of these children, assuming he was a transient, a man who would soon tire of the burden. He looked at Thomas, who was tracing the outline of the carved bird in his lap. The boy's face was pale. Elias knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he couldn't let that happen. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, small fissures began to appear in the wall of the children's silence. Lydia, the 5-year-old, had been watching him mend a broken hinge on the cabin door, her thumb firmly in her mouth. When he finally got the door to swing smoothly, without its usual groan, a tiny smile touched her lips before she quickly hid her face in Sarah's skirt. It was a fleeting thing, but Elias saw it. One evening, as he sat by the fire attempting to whittle a crude animal shape from a piece of scrapwood, something to quiet his own restless thoughts, young Samuel, one of the 8-year-old twins, crept closer. "What's that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Elias held it out. "Supposed to be a horse." "Not a very good 1-inch." Samuel reached out a tentative finger and touched its unevenly carved manet. "Mama made us a horse once," he said softly, a shadow of memory in his eyes. Elias continued to whittle, not pressing, letting the boy set the pace. Daniel, Samuel's twin, soon joined him, and for a few minutes, they watched in companionable silence, a fragile truce forming in the flickering firelight. The biggest challenge remained Sarah. She worked tirelessly, her young shoulders carrying the weight of her mother's responsibilities, but her distrust of Elias was a palpable thing. She anticipated his needs, managed the younger children, but her interactions with him were strictly functional, her face a mask of stoic resilience. Then Mary, the quiet 10-year-old, fell ill. A fever, much like the one that had taken her mother. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped Elias. He remembered Henderson's words about Martha worrying herself sick. He couldn't lose another one. He sat with Mary through the night, bathing her forehead with cool water, forcing sips of willow bark tea between her parched lips. Sarah hovered nearby, her anxiety a raw wound. She watched him, her usual defiance replaced by a desperate hope. "She'll be all right, won't she?" Sarah finally whispered, her voice cracking. Elias met her gaze. "We'll do everything we can for 3 days." They fought the fever together. Elias, drawing on half-forgotten remedies his own mother had used, and Sarah, surprisingly adept at nursing, her earlier suspicions momentarily forgotten in her fear for her sister. When Mary's fever finally broke, leaving her weak but lucid, the relief in the small cabin was immense. Sarah looked at Elias, her eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion, and for the first time, he saw not suspicion, but a glimmer of something akin to gratitude. Later, while searching for some clean rags, he found a small, cedar box tucked away under Martha's pallet. Inside, nestled amongst dried lavender, were several more letters addressed to him but unsent. And a pair of tiny, knitted baby booties, blue. Unfinished. One needle still held the stitches. Martha had been preparing, hoping, dreaming. The weight of her lost dreams, her fierce love for these children, pressed down on him, solidifying his resolve. These were not just children she had left behind, they were her legacy of love and hope, a legacy he was now, inexplicably, a part of. The prairie winds turned colder, carrying the first stinging pellets of sleet. Winter was no longer a distant threat but a harsh reality knocking at their flimsy door. Elias redoubled his efforts, his days a blur of chopping wood, banking the cabin with earth and sod, and checking the snares he'd set in the sparse thickets along the creek. The meager harvest from Martha's untended garden, a few hardy squashes and some frost-nipped potatoes, was stored carefully, each item precious. He knew it wouldn't be enough. The children, witnessing his ceaseless activity, began to contribute more actively. Thomas, overcoming his initial reticence, proved to be a surprisingly good tracker, helping Elias check the snare lines. Sarah, though still reserved, took charge of rationing their food with a solemn efficiency that belied her years, ensuring the younger ones always had a little extra. Mary, recovering her strength, helped keep the cabin as clean as their rudimentary tools allowed, while the twins, Samuel and Daniel, were tasked with keeping the wood box filled, a chore they undertook with a newfound sense of importance. Even little Lydia tried to help, carefully wiping the single pewter plate they shared with a damp rag. A routine, born of necessity, began to structure their days. Simple meals, shared chores, and in the evenings, by the dim light of the fire, Elias would sometimes read aloud from Martha's worn Bible, its familiar cadences a comfort in the encroaching darkness. He wasn't a particularly religious man, but he saw the way the younger children leaned into Sarah or Thomas, their eyes wide, listening to the ancient stories of trial and perseverance. He tried to teach them what he knew, some scratched onto a piece of slate he'd found, letters of the alphabet. His own education had been rudimentary, but he gave them what he could. The shared hardship was a crucible, slowly forging new bonds. Laughter, hesitant at first, began to be heard in the cabin, a response to one of the twins' clumsy antics, or Ben's delighted gurgles when Elias swung him gently in the air. The memory of Martha was a constant, unspoken presence. Her worn shawl still hung on a peg by the door. Her gardening tools leaned against the outside wall, awaiting a spring she would never see. Elias often found himself wondering what she would have thought of him, this stranger who had stumbled into her life, or rather, into the void she had left. He was not the husband she had hoped for, not the partner she had envisioned. But as he looked at the children, huddled together against the cold, their faces turned towards him with a growing, fragile trust, he knew he had to be something more. He had to be their shield against the coming storm. The storm arrived not as a blizzard, but as a knock on the door one cold afternoon. A stout woman with a stern face, Mrs. Albright, the wife of the town deacon, stood on the threshold, accompanied by a nervous-looking man Elias recognized as a member of the nascent town council. Mrs. Albright's gaze swept critically over the cabin's interior, lingering on the children who had fallen silent at her entrance. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice firm, leaving no room for pleasantries, "we've come out of concern for these children." Elias felt his hackles rise, but kept his voice even. "They are well cared for," Mrs. Albright sniffed. "That is a matter of opinion. 7 children, sir, in the care of a single man, a stranger to this community, with no familial connection. It is not a suitable arrangement. The councilman shifted uncomfortably. There's been talk, Mr. Thorne. Some folks feel the children would be better placed. Perhaps the orphanage in Omaha for the younger ones. The older ones could be indentured, learn a trade. Elias's hands clenched. He saw Sarah's face pale, her eyes darting towards him, filled with a sudden, raw fear that mirrored his own anger. Thomas moved to stand beside her, his small frame rigid. These children will not be split up, Elias stated, his voice low and dangerous. Their mother entrusted them to this home. And I will see they remain here. Mrs. Albright's lips thinned. Mrs. Jennings is gone, sir. Her wishes, while perhaps understandable, are not paramount now. The welfare of the children is. And frankly, this hovel is hardly adequate. They need a woman's care, proper schooling, a Christian upbringing in a more stable environment. They have a home, Elias said, stepping forward slightly, positioning himself between the visitors and the children. They have food in their bellies, a roof, albeit imperfect, over their heads, and they are together. That is more stability than any orphanage or scattered indenture could offer. The councilman looked uneasy. Mr. Thorne, Mrs. Albright means well, I'm sure she does, Elias cut in, his gaze unwavering. But these are Martha Jennings's children. And they are now my responsibility. I will not see them taken. There was a tense silence. Mrs. Albright looked from Elias to the children, her expression unyielding. We will discuss this further with the council, Mr. Thorne. This is not the end of the matter. With a final disapproving glance, she turned and swept out, the councilman scurrying after her. Elias watched them go, his heart pounding. The threat was real, more tangible than the winter cold. He turned back to the children. Sarah was looking at him, her usual guarded expression replaced by something new, a flicker of awe, perhaps, and a dawning understanding. He had stood for them. He had called them his. In that moment, the lines of stranger and interloper blurred significantly. He was their defender. The visit from Mrs. Albright and the councilman was a stark reminder of their precarious situation, but it also acted as an unexpected catalyst. Sarah, who had witnessed Elias's quiet but fierce defense of their makeshift family, began to see him in a new light. The wall of her suspicion, already weakened by his care for Mary, started to crumble. She still missed her mother with an ache that was a constant companion, but the fear of this stranger lessened, replaced by a grudging respect that slowly blossomed into something warmer. One evening, as Elias struggled to patch Thomas's worn-out boots by the firelight, his fingers clumsy with the needle and all, Sarah sat down beside him. "Let me," she said quietly, taking the boot from his hand. Her own stitches were neater, more practiced. They worked in comfortable silence for a while. "She taught me," Sarah said, her voice soft. "Mama." She said, "A body needs good boots, more than near anything else out here." Elias nodded, not trusting himself to speak. It was the first time she had voluntarily spoken of her mother in such a way to him, without prompting, without bitterness. A shared memory, offered like a tentative gift. The other children, sensitive to the shift in Sarah's attitude, relaxed further in Elias's presence. Thomas began to ask him questions about the world beyond the prairie, about the cities Elias had passed through. Mary, no longer as timid, would sometimes hum softly as she helped with chores, a sound her mother had loved. The twins, Samuel and Daniel, started to treat him with a boisterous affection, tugging on his coat, demanding stories, their earlier fear forgotten. Even little Lydia would sometimes abandon Sarah's skirt to toddle over and solemnly offer Elias a smooth stone or a pretty weed she had found. The cabin, though still poor and crowded, began to resonate with a different energy. It was less a shelter against grief and more a place of fragile, emerging hope. Elias found himself looking forward to the evenings, to the small circle of faces lit by the fire, their reliance on him no longer feeling like a burden, but a profound, grounding purpose. He started incorporating things he'd learned from Martha's journal into their routine, a particular way she liked the cornbread made, a song she used to sing to the younger ones. He wasn't trying to replace her, he knew he never could. But he could honor her memory by nurturing the children she had loved so fiercely. He was beginning to understand the depth of her sacrifice, the sheer force of will it must have taken for her to keep going, for their sake. And in honoring her, he found himself becoming the father they needed, a role he had never sought, never imagined, but one that was slowly, surely, claiming his heart. Spring arrived late on the prairie, a hesitant green blush spreading across the vast, brown land. The icy grip of winter loosened, and with it, a sense of renewal permeated the small cabin. Elias, with Thomas and a surprisingly eager Sarah by his side, began to prepare the small plot of land Martha had hoped to cultivate. The soil was hard, unyielding at first, but they persevered, turning it over spadeful by spadeful, their shared labor a silent testament to their growing unity. One afternoon, while clearing a patch of stubborn weeds near the remains of Martha's small herb garden, Sarah unearthed a tin box, rusted shut. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was another letter, its ink faded but legible. It was addressed to Elias, but it was clear Martha had written it for herself as much as for him, perhaps when her illness first took hold, a final outpouring of her hopes and fears. "If you are reading this, Mr. Thorne," it began, "then I am gone, and my dearest wish is that you have found it in your heart to care for my children. They are good children, full of light, though life has dealt them harsh blows. Teach them kindness. Teach them to be strong. This land is hard, but it can also be bountiful if met with courage and persistence. I had hoped to share that struggle, that bounty, with you. Perhaps, in some way, you still can." Through them, tears pricked Elias's eyes as he read her words. Her quiet strength, her unwavering love for her children, reached out to him from the faded page. He looked at Sarah, who was watching him, her own eyes glistening. He handed her the letter. She read it slowly, her lips moving silently. When she looked up, there was a new understanding in her gaze, a shared sense of purpose that transcended their individual grief. They would make this land bountiful, not for Martha, but because of her. They planted the seeds Henderson had advanced them on credit, corn, beans, squash, the same humble crops Martha would have chosen. The younger children helped, their small hands patting the earth, their faces smudged with dirt and earnest concentration. Laughter echoed more freely now, mingling with the songs of the meadowlarks. Elias taught Thomas how to whittle, not just crude animals, but useful things, pegs for the cabin, handles for tools. He showed Mary how to identify edible berries and roots. He even let the twins help him repair the old fence, their enthusiastic but clumsy efforts more hindrance than help, yet he praised their work, seeing the pride in their eyes. He was no longer just a caretaker, a reluctant guardian. He was building a life here with them. This place, once a symbol of his shattered dreams and Martha's tragic end, was slowly transforming. It was becoming home, a testament to resilience, to the unexpected ways a family could be forged. The echoes of Martha were everywhere, not as sorrowful ghosts, but as gentle reminders of the love that had laid the foundation for their improbable future. More than a year had passed since Elias Thorne first set foot on this patch of Nebraska prairie. The raw, skeletal cabin now stood a little straighter, its roof patched securely, its windows glazed, however imperfectly. A curl of smoke rose steadily from the chimney, a beacon of warmth and life in the vast landscape. The fields around it, once choked with weeds, now showed neat rows of ripening corn and thriving squash vines, a testament to a summer of shared labor. Inside, the cabin was still small, still crowded, but it was clean, and an air of settled peace had replaced the earlier tension and despair. The 7 children were no longer the hollow-eyed, fearful specters he had first encountered. Thomas, on the cusp of young manhood, worked alongside Elias with a quiet competence, his shoulders broadening, his gaze steady. Sarah, though still carrying a woman's responsibilities, had allowed some of her girlhood to resurface, a quick smile, a light in her eyes when she teased her younger siblings. Mary, gentle and observant, had become Elias's quiet helper, anticipating needs, her presence a calming influence. The twins, Samuel and Daniel, were wiry and full of boundless energy, their mischief now tempered with a willingness to contribute. Lydia, no longer clinging, chattered happily as she played near the doorstep, and Ben, a sturdy toddler, toddled confidently towards Elias, arms outstretched for his evening toss in the air. Elias looked at them, a deep, quiet satisfaction settling in his heart. This was not the life he had envisioned when he'd read Martha's hopeful letters. He had come seeking a wife, a partner, a new beginning for himself. Instead, he had found a family, forged in the crucible of loss and hardship. He had found a purpose far greater than any he could have imagined. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Elias sat on the porch step with Sarah. They watched the younger children chasing fireflies in the twilight. "Mama would have liked this," Sarah said softly, her voice no longer tinged with sorrow, but with a gentle acceptance. "She would have liked to see them happy," Elias nodded. "She'd be proud of them." Of you, Sarah leaned her head back against the porch post, a rare moment of repose. "Thank you, Elias," she said, her voice barely a whisper. For staying, he didn't reply with words. He simply reached out and briefly, gently, squeezed her shoulder. It was enough. The memory of Martha Jennings was woven into the fabric of their lives, not as a shadow of what was lost, but as the enduring spirit that had brought them all together, the catalyst for the unexpected love that now bound them. He had arrived to find 7 children and no wife, a future shattered before it began. But in their innocent faces, in their growing trust, in the shared rhythm of their days, Elias Thorne had found something more profound. He had become the father they wished for, the anchor they needed. And in doing so, he had found his own hard-won home, a quiet promise fulfilled under the vast prairie sky.